Hello and welcome to this month's Rights in Russia interview. Today is April 30th, 2024, and our guest is Andreas Umland, a German political scientist who studies recent Russian and Ukrainian history and regime transitions. His published research includes work on the post-Soviet extreme right, European fascism, post-communist higher education, East European geopolitics, Ukrainian and Russian nationalism, the Donbas and Crimea conflicts, and the political framework for continuing integration of Southern and Eastern countries into the EU. An analyst at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, Dr. Umland lives in Kyiv and teaches as an associate professor of politics at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. In 2005 to 14, he was involved in the creation of a master's program in German and European Studies administered jointly by the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and Jena University. Welcome to Rights in Russia, Andreas.
Thanks for having me again.
You know, we last spoke on this program in March of 2022, and a lot has happened since then. Looking back, I think there was at that time first a widespread feeling that Russia might secure a quick victory, and then as time passed that Ukraine would continue to have rapid successes. What we have now seems a kind of military stalemate, although most recently there have been reports of Russian advances. Is that a fair description of the past 2 years? And where are we at present? How significant are those Russian advances?
Yes, there was, after this Russian advance of 2022, then the counteroffensive of Ukraine in the Kharkiv and Kherson Oblast, and basically the liberation of almost half of what Russia had occupied in the first weeks of the war. That was around August, September 2022. And then a reaction by Russia, for instance, to this was then the annexation of 4 oblasts of mainland Ukraine, Luhanska, Donetska, Zaporizhzhia, and Khersonska. The odd thing about this was that at the time of the annexation, none of these 4 oblasts was actually under the full control of Russia, and then Kherson was liberated. So this was a strange time in a way, and also a time of hope, of course, for Ukraine, because the paradox of 2022 was that Ukraine was able to launch this counteroffensive, and a relatively successful counteroffensive, although it still had largely Soviet weaponry. It had already received at that point some Western weaponry, but not to a large extent, and especially no heavy weaponry to a large extent. And then there was a lot of hope in 2023 that once then, over the winter of 2022-2023, a relatively large amount of Western heavy weaponry arrived in Ukraine, and also the army of the Ukrainian army was built up, that there would be then another successful counteroffensive, and that didn't work out. The Russians then dug in over this winter, and they were basically waiting for the counteroffensive of Ukraine happening, and were able to basically defend the already occupied territories more or less successfully. And what we have now is a sort of a new switch of the situation, that over the last winter, basically the situation of the Ukrainian army and of Ukraine in general deteriorated, especially concerning ammunition, but also the general financial situation of Ukraine. The support by the West went down. The help package, the support package by the US was stuck in Congress for 6 months. And against this background, now Ukraine has lost some of the territories again that it had liberated in 2022. But these Russian advances over the last months, they have been relatively minor. There were certain victories in places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, but there wasn't a major territorial gain over this last period, although it was to the advantage of Russia overall rather than Ukraine. Ukraine had some successes at the same time in the Black Sea. It shot down Russian fighter planes and sunk a few more ships, and also attacked military installations in Crimea, and also the sort of Ukrainian drone war has been altogether a success in that Ukraine has, with its own drones, attacked a lot of installations, industrial and military installations in the Russian rear in Russian territory. What we now indeed have, as you rightly said, is a sort of stalemate, and what the hope is now that perhaps these advances in in Ukrainian drone technology, in combination with the arrival of this American help package and also of ammunition from the European Union, basically, perhaps there could be then again an advantageous situation for Ukraine. Whether this will be already in 2024 is difficult to say, but perhaps in 2025 there will be then again a new offensive by Ukraine, if the Western support will continue, and also will continue to grow as it did in the last few weeks. There were quite a few new, apart from the American package, quite a few new initiatives. The United Kingdom, for instance, has just announced a week ago its largest help package, military aid package during the war. So it's an open situation, and a lot depends on Western support.
And how would you describe the mood in Kyiv at the present time among the people?
Well, it depends partly, of course, on whom you ask, but certainly it's a less optimistic mood than there was last year at this time, when the counteroffensive was still coming, and when people had a lot of hope that perhaps over the summer the war could be perhaps even won already, because there was a lot of expectation back then. There's now much less expectation, also a lot of disillusionment with the US, with this 6 months delay in the military aid package, and also a lot of wariness about the US elections later this year, and what a Trump presidency would mean for Ukraine. So but still, the people, I mean, all this frustration and partly depression, it doesn't translate then into some sort of defeatism and readiness to forego political sovereignty or territory for some sort of fishy deal with Russia. So if you look also on the opinion polls, there's still a large majority which says we need to get back all of our territories that have been occupied. We need to liberate all Ukrainian territories. The mood is much less optimistic, but still that doesn't translate into some sort of readiness, or at least not in a readiness of the majority of the population to give away territories.
So a question now on sanctions. Earlier, when sanctions were just put in place, some people thought that cutting off Russian gas and oil exports to Western Europe would cause financial distress in Russia and be an insurmountable problem for the Putin regime. But it seems to have simply driven Russia toward dependence on China. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, it turned out that these sanctions were not nearly as effective as most people, including myself, had expected. The sanctions package was large, and Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world. Certainly the trade with the European Union and with the US has now largely come to a halt. There's still some sort of trade via third countries, which is sort of semi-legal. And there's also some of the Russian energies going as LNG, for instance, into Europe. A lot has been done, but what has not been counted in is that Russia has other options, and that other countries would step in and would actually take advantage of this situation, countries like China and India, and they would basically compensate, in a way, Russia for the losses it has in Europe and with North America. And the sad lesson from these last 2 years is that if you impose a sanctions regime, what you have to do is to conduct a global trade war against the country that you want to sanction. So you have to be ready to not just sanction the country that you want to sanction, but also all of the other countries that are then sort of taking advantage of this situation. So you have to impose these so-called secondary sanctions. Unless you do that, actually the primary sanctions may not have the effect. The sanctions did have an effect, of course, on Russia, that perhaps without the sanctions, or probably without the sanctions, Russia would be now in a much better economic situation, and also the military of the Russian army, of the Russian state would have functioned better without sanctions. So the sanctions did have an effect, and they are costly for Russia, but they have not constrained Russia to a sufficient degree. So I hope that the conclusion will now actually be drawn that you have to become serious about actually secondary sanctions, and you have to not only sanction Russian companies and persons, but also non-Russian companies and persons who are trading with Russia.
Do you think Putin's reelection has any significance as far as the war is concerned? To what extent was it important for Putin to interpret the election, as it were, as support for the war? And what was the significance of individuals who became known to the public as potential anti-war candidates before they were disbarred from standing?
Well, unfortunately, the result of the election is a sort of consolidation of the regime. And here I would, obviously Putin had an interest in doing that, and I would blame the Russian opposition for not being able to better take advantage of these elections. Of course, it's very costly to become an oppositionist in Russia, and it's a draconian state which is very repressive. What I was always sort of surprised and still being surprised is that there has never been an attempt by Russian civil society, as far as it still exists, and Russian opposition forces, to try to conduct a general strike. So to not call for protests and for going on the streets and fighting the regime, but simply to call on people to stay at home if they don't want the war to continue, Putin to be elected, and so on. And I wonder why something like that has never been tried. And my suspicion is actually that the people who may have wanted to try that understood that it wouldn't work, that people would not actually do the strike, and that there would be this collective action problem. On the one hand, that people would perhaps not be against the strike because they would want the war to end, but they would not be sort of active enough to and devoted enough to go themselves on strike and to actually conduct a strike. And there are apparently also many people who just want a victory and not peace. They want or they want a victory. Maybe they want also peace, but they want a victorious peace. They want Ukraine to lose, Russia to win, and then they, as long as there is no victory for Russia inside, they would not go on strike. And that is, of course, a very sad conclusion, which means that, it's not Putin's war, it's Russia's war.
You mentioned already the 6-month delay in U.S. support and how that bill was frozen in Congress for so long. I mean, what effect does this have on the way that people view the U.S. and possibly the EU as a reliable partner in this effort? I mean, does it extend to kind of the general population?
Yes, I mean, now everybody is scared because that was something unexpected to happen, and it dragged on month after month, and there was this expectation, now they will do that, and it was almost unbelievable with every additional month that this was still not going through. And then there was also great relief when finally it did go through the House of Representatives and then also the Senate. And now there is, of course, a lot of wariness about what will happen if the elections will produce a second Trump presidency. How will Trump behave? Apparently, he was behind this delay, and how in general the U.S. can be relied on, and whether if then the U.S. for one reason or another will not support Ukraine anymore. Whether the Europeans and perhaps some other countries like Japan, Australia, and so on that are supportive of Ukraine will be able to compensate for this loss of the US as a supporter. And unfortunately, I have to say I'm skeptical because especially the military side will be very difficult for the other countries, even if they all get together to cover, because the US is just in what concerns military affairs. The civilian side, yes. I mean, there's also a lot of, in the civilian field, a lot of help that is necessary for Ukraine, reconstruction and financial help and so on. That is something that the EU, together with Japan and Australia and others, could perhaps shoulder. But the military side will be difficult. So that is also one of the reasons I think that the war is still, from the Russian side, conducted as it is being conducted, because the Russians are basically waiting for a Trump presidency and then for a military victory.
How likely do you think it is that the war will end in some kind of compromise reached as a result of negotiations?
I don't think that, I mean, the negotiations may end the war, but I don't think it will be a compromise. It will be rather an imposed sort of ceasefire or peace from the one side or the other. I don't think that there's really space for compromise. I've actually published an article on this in the National Interest where I outline what the problems are here. For instance, one thing that many people think could be an object of compromise is Crimea. So that basically Ukraine would give away Crimea, and then maybe Putin could be persuaded somehow to withdraw from mainland Ukraine, which I don't think is really something that Putin or a successor of Putin can easily do, because also mainland territories have been annexed now to Russia. But even that, this sort of Crimea scenario, Crimea for peace, basically, is not easy for Russia to implement. I mean, it's not also easy for Ukraine to accept something like that. The problem of Crimea is that it is geographically in a very difficult situation, and one of the reasons actually for the escalation in 2022 was exactly this isolation of Crimea, that it is vulnerable, that it is far away from Russia, that it needs the land connection, and that historically Crimea belongs to Ukraine. And it has also, if you look at the history of Crimea during the Crimean Khanate, when it was sort of part of the Ottoman Empire, then of the Tsarist Empire, then of the Soviet Union, you have only 22 years in which Crimea was actually linked to Russia, from 1922 till 1954. In the Tsarist Empire, it was part of the Tauric government, which covered much of what is today southern Ukraine, both mainland southern Ukraine and Crimea. Crimea was linked to southern Ukraine and the Crimean Khanate before the first annexation of 1783. And then Crimea was, after 1954, linked to Soviet Ukraine administratively, and then to independent Ukraine. So Crimea is a part of Ukraine. And so not only can Ukraine give away Crimea easily, but also Russia cannot give away the southern mainland territories easily, because it would then end up again with an isolated exclave that is difficult to sustain, that is isolated from Russia, and that has no economic future, basically. And so there's a lot of illusion here about a compromise that can be achieved, that is floating around. I hear that a lot from diplomats and politicians and so on. But if you look at the actual situation, if you go into the details and the empirical side of it, it's actually very difficult to implement a compromise.
Mm-hmm. As you have pointed out, right, that Crimea has been central to this whole war. And in fact, that's where the war began. So I'm wondering, what is life like now in Crimea under Russian occupation? And what's the general situation there at the moment?
That's a good question. Maybe I shouldn't answer to that, because I haven't been to Crimea since the annexation, obviously. So it's difficult to judge for me what exactly is the situation. What I hear, however, is that oddly, some of those people who have welcomed, for instance, ethnic Russians on Crimea, who have welcomed the annexation in 2014, are actually now rather in favor of a return of Crimea to Ukraine, to not only de jure, but also de facto Ukrainian control, because they are not happy about the annexation. And that was actually a mood already before the escalation in 2022. So it's difficult to say what the situation there is now. Maybe I shouldn't answer that. It's better to ask somebody who may have visited Crimea, actually.
Right. Thinking now about the many close personal relationships between Ukrainians and Russians that have existed historically, to what extent do such relationships still exist, and how difficult is communication now between individuals living in Ukraine and Russia, and is it in fact possible?
Yeah, there are, not only friendships and acquaintances, but also lots of relatives, over the border, Russians living in Ukraine who have relatives in Russia, Ukrainians living in Russia who have relatives here in Ukraine. So a lot of connections, but I think there's now many of these connections are now broken, and I don't think they will be easily restored. I guess there can be still sort of a connection and reconciliation and so on, if there is on the Russian side an acknowledgement of a certain responsibility, of a certain guilt, I would also say. And it depends, I guess, on the families also, how they see this war. So I guess there are as many changes to these connections as there are such family ties, I would suspect, and they can be, very, very cold or non-existent, and they may be still warm in spite of the war. But of course, what I hear is from sort of, but that is more hearsay. I have to say is that a lot of these connections have broken down, and people basically don't speak with each other anymore.
Looking back, could the West have done things to prevent the war? And did we miss any opportunity for a peace agreement early on?
Well, I mean, there were lots of agreements. You know, I mean, the oldest one of these agreements is the one between Moldova and Russia from 1994, when Russia agreed to withdraw its troops from Moldova, from Transnistria. And also in 1994, Moldova adopted a new constitution where it declared itself a neutral country and thereby excluded a future accession to NATO. And in spite of this agreement, in spite of the exclusion of a NATO accession in the Moldovan constitution, Article 11, Russia simply didn't withdraw its troops. There's still Russian troops in Transnistria, and you know, the similar story then goes for Georgia, where also Russia promised to withdraw its troops from Abkhazia and the Kyiv-Mohyla region, but didn't do so. And now there have actually more people died in the peace situation between Georgia and Russia than during the war, the 5-day war in 2008. And also for Ukraine, there is the Geneva Declaration of April 2014, the Minsk agreements of September 2014 and February 2015, and the key articles of these agreements, like with Moldova and Georgia, have not been observed for Russia. So even if there had been some additional agreement, that's also something that now comes across to me a lot, that people are now discussing the so-called Istanbul communique and the negotiations in Istanbul in April 2014. For me, the question is, okay, even in the best case scenario, that there would have been some document that Russia would have signed. I wonder, you know, against the background of the Minsk agreements, the Geneva Declaration, the so-called Sarkozy Plan, which was the Georgian Russian peace treaty, the Moldovan-Russian treaty from 1994, would actually Russia have observed the key provisions of such a peace agreement? So that is I think that is an alternative history that, on the basis of the history that we do know, we don't know what the alternative history, of course, would have been, but on the basis of the history that we do know of such agreements, and I mean, there are many others as well, the Budapest Memorandum, the Russian-Ukrainian border treaty, the Belarush agreement from 1991. All of these things have been broken, and for me there's no good reason to believe that some sort of agreement, either before the large-scale invasion or during the large-scale invasion, would be observed by Russia without actually, you know, some sort of partial victory, I would call it, for Ukraine. Then perhaps something could be imposed on Russia and then implemented that would work. I think the only way to prevent this war would have been, you know, some sort of stronger Western support. I mean, ideally, of course, a NATO accession of Ukraine, but you know, weapons deliveries, another coalition, another alliance, perhaps not between NATO and not via an inclusion of Ukraine into NATO, but let's say an upgrade of the Budapest Memorandum into a full-scale military alliance, something like that could have done the trick to increase the costs for Russia, and especially after 2014, then to prevent a further escalation. I think, you know, after the Crimea annexation, this non-action by the West became fully fully strange. Already before that, it was dysfunctional and then became even more dysfunctional. So, yeah, I think that, you know, it's basically we are back to the Cold War. It's containment, you know, and if you don't contain, well, then you don't contain the imperial power. And it's an imperial tradition that is 500 years old, and to have some sort of talks and documents signed and some sort of, you know, agreement and some sort of, you know, council or memorandum, or however you want to call it, will not simply disable this age-old Russian imperial tradition.
Mm-hmm. So for my last question, how do you see the war developing over the next few months? And I wondered if you had further thoughts about the significance of the upcoming US elections for the conflict itself.
It's difficult to say. I mean, there are so many factors in it. It's basically going to be a race, well, an arms race at the end of the day, and also a question of the degree of financial support for Ukraine. So one of the problems that is now often mentioned that Ukraine allegedly has is that it does not have enough soldiers. But in fact, you know, I'm here in Kyiv now. There are a lot of men in the appropriate age that are around in Ukraine. And what the problem is, however, is that the package that these, the financial and social package that these soldiers get from that the Ukrainian state is able to pay them, that's not just the salary, but also, you know, the sort of compensation for being maimed or becoming an invalid and so on, and for also for death, then for the remaining families, it's too small. So if the West could help with that, creating a veterans, you know, fund for the remaining families and so on, that would then increase the attractiveness simply of the of military service, and then I think this could be actually solved in a way there, and also with more help in restructuring the functioning of the Ukrainian army, so that there's more trust by men in Ukraine, and also women. There's also lots of female soldiers to enter military service, and then even if you come out then maimed, and or even if you die, actually your family will be you know, will be in a good situation, or if you're maimed, you're then taken care of somehow. So this has to change, and of course the ammunition situation, the technology has to arrive. It depends. Russia has its own partners in that: North Korea, Iran, China, and Ukraine has a lot of potentially very powerful allies, from the US to the EU, Japan, and so on. So it depends on you know, what will be the correlation of forces, as a Soviet analyst would say at the end, how much Ukraine will get support, and then we can actually have. I'm not excluding a new surprise. We already had two surprises in this war. Was the defense of Ukraine in the first weeks, and then the counteroffensive after a few months. So there can be a new surprise, but for that the support has to be resolute. And what will be the result then of the presidential elections in the US? I mean, you are in the US, you would better know what this could mean. And I'm not sure that Trump will be for 100% already a disaster for Ukraine. It depends perhaps on his own interests, but also on the other institutions of the US. It depends also on the population, how far ordinary Americans will express their support, and then I guess the politicians will adapt to the popular preferences. So I hope that even a Trump victory will not be the end of American support for for Ukraine. If the US is going to continue to support Ukraine, I think the EU is now coming around. The EU is now changing itself, and we have now every month new agreements between Ukraine and European countries, security agreements. We have new packages being announced. We have new initiatives. So the EU, after a while, has actually become quite active. And if that continues, if the US support continues, then I would think Ukraine will win at the end. That will be then, by the way, also I think the end of Putin's regime.
Thank you so much for this really rich discussion and for sharing your historical insights, your political analysis, and your on-the-ground perspectives for rights in Russia. I hope our next meeting will be in better times. Andreas Umland, thank you so much.
I hope so too. Thanks a lot.